To another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for listening to the show. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to comment@am950radio.com. And I believe that this episode, I think, marks the one-year anniversary for the show. I think my first one played the first weekend in July of last year, so we made it for a year. Thanks again for all you listeners to the show and for all your support. I appreciate it. So hopefully, we can keep going for another year. So thanks again for all the support. So on this week's show, we're going to cover the 26th Amendment. So we're almost done with that. And I'm going to talk about Zohran Mamdani's win in the New York City primary for mayor that happened recently. And then an update on the big, horrible bill that just passed the Senate. So just again, one kind of word here. I am taping this Wednesday morning, and the show airs on Sunday night. So certainly things on this big, horrible bill could happen in between that time. So... But, everybody's watching that to see if it'll be done by July 4th like Trump is demanding. So we'll have to wait and see on that. So let's start with the 26th Amendment. And we have one more left after that, and then we'll be through with the Constitution. So the 26th Amendment is one that affects just about everybody. This is the one that lowered the voting age to 18. For all federal, state, and local elections. So before the amendment passed, some states had a different age, typically 21. Well, most of them did, as I'll mention here in a little bit. When it comes to allowing people to vote in state elections. So this amendment changed that to federal, state, and local elections. The voting age is now 18. So first, I'm going to go through a little bit of the history kind of behind the amendment, and then we'll get into the amendment itself, which is a pretty short one as far as they go. So, typically, like a lot of amendments, there's been, before it actually passed in 1971, there were attempts in Congress to lower the voting age. But I mentioned in previous episodes about how our government is one of federalism, where in some cases the federal government controls stuff for the federal government, and then the state governments control it for state and local governments. And voting is one of those items where you get both federal and state governments involved in it, and mainly the state and local governments deal with the election stuff. So but what this amendment does is lowers the voting age down to 18 for federal, state, and local elections. So this really started gaining more ground during World War II. So, at that point in time, the draft age was 21, but then when World War II started, FDR lowered it to 18. So people were starting to say, well, if I'm old enough to go die for my country, why can't I vote for my leaders who are going to send me to go die potentially in foreign lands? So there were a bunch of groups that, started arguing that, hey, we gotta lower the voting age down to 18, since, a lot of people were being drafted at that point. Even Dwight Eisenhower, he was one of the commanders during World War II, and he became the president during most of the 50s. And in 1954, he even talked about lowering the voting age to 18 in his State of the Union address that he gave that year. So, again, there were attempts in Congress, but, you got to get 2/3 of both the House and the Senate to, propose a amendment, and they just weren't able to do it. Even with, the President Eisenhower supporting it. And there was another commission that came out in 1963, a presidential commission on registration and voting participation came out, in their report that said, hey, we got to lower the voting age to 18 for federal, state, and local elections. So that kind of sets up, how kind of the background, and then I'm going to talk about how it actually came to be. So the civil rights movement, of course, started in the 60s, that got more and more attention. And part of that was lowering the voting age to 18. That was part of the civil rights movement as well. Then we also had the Vietnam conflict. Now, I call it conflict here just because, it's just as a reminder, the United States did not declare war on Vietnam. But that's what it's called, is the Vietnam War. But just a reminder, we didn't declare war there. And that also became a big deal, and a lot of, the people who were protesting the war were also advocating for lowering the voting age, because here again, it's the same sort of argument they used in World War II. Is like, hey, you're sending me over to die in Vietnam, I should be able to vote. So Congress, when it passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, part of that act lowered the age to vote in federal elections to age 18. So that was a federal law that lowered just the federal election. So if you were 18, you could vote for president and your senators and your House of Representatives people, for federal elections. But depending on where in most states, you couldn't vote for your state people or your local people unless you were 21. All right, so this Voting Rights Act contained a provision just lowering it to age 18 for federal elections. All right, so, once the Vietnam was getting, worse and worse and worse, and more people were out in the streets protesting, and, part of it was to lower the voting age. In 1970, okay, we're still in the Vietnam War era, Congress passed an extension to the Voting Rights Act that I mentioned before, and they lowered the voting age to 18 in federal, state, and local elections. So they took the next step to also lower it to 18 in state and local elections. President Nixon signed it, but he said, well, I think that part is unconstitutional, because, his argument was, well, that's a state deal. That's a state election. They have the power, not the federal government, when it comes to state and local elections. So, basically after the law was signed, Oregon, Arizona, Texas, and Idaho sued, saying, hey, this is unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court, in December of 1970, ruled that, that part that said that this covers state and local elections is unconstitutional, because the state has the power over that, not the federal government. So, as I've talked about before, when the Supreme Court issues some decision that Congress doesn't like, Congress can then, one of the things they can do is try and do a constitutional amendment, which is what they did here. Okay, so after that decision in December of 1970 said, nah, you can't lower it to 18 for state and local elections, then Congress got enough votes to propose the constitutional amendment, which was passed on March 23rd, 1971, out of Congress. And the votes weren't even that close. So in the House, it was 401 for the proposal and only 19 against. And in the Senate, it was 94-0. Right? So you won't see any votes like that in the House and Senate anymore. particularly on a constitutional amendment. But here we go. This was 1971, and it was a huge victory in Congress. So they easily overcame that 2/3 in the House and in the Senate. And not surprisingly, enough states ratified this amendment it became effective July 1st of 1971. So, that was fast. That was like 3.5 months or something like that, even that long. So this 26th Amendment, this is the fastest ratification of any amendment to the Constitution. And here's another little trivia here. Minnesota was the first state to ratify this amendment. And they did it right away on March 23rd, 1971, after it was out of Congress. They were all ready to go that day, and they passed it at 3:14 in the afternoon at the Minnesota State Legislature. And there were 4 other states that also passed it on that day, but we were the first one, time-wise, that did it. And, again, lots of states passed it. 7 states, though, didn't vote on it, as it turns out, but so at that point, 18 was now the voting age in federal, state, and local elections. But prior to that amendment, there were only 4 states that reduced it to 18, which was Georgia, Kentucky, Alaska, and Hawaii. Otherwise, you had to be 21 to vote in state elections. So the effect of this, of course, was to get 18, 19, and 20-year-olds now to vote in all of the elections. So here is the actual language of the 26th Amendment. Again, it's pretty short, so I'm just reading it verbatim here. So Section 1, the right of citizens, I'll come back to that again in a minute here. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. And then Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So again, that Section 2 is common now in many of the amendments, as we've seen. So Section 1 is basically, again, this refers to citizens. Okay, you got to be a citizen to vote. So, all these claims by the Republicans that, all these, undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants or whatever term you want to use are, crashing the polls and they're all voting for Democrats and blah, 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 blah. That's all a load of crap. You have to be a citizen to vote. And there's ways that they check it. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So that's the first key part, is you got to be a citizen to vote. And this Section 1 said, okay, not only does this cover federal elections, but this also covers any state or local election, and the states cannot change it from 18. Okay, and that's where we are. Now, there are some movements out there to try and raise that back up, because, and I even hear this occasionally from some of my students who are mainly high school students. It's like, well, 18's too young. We got to go back up to 21, or even I've even heard some 25 years of age, and where some people said, well, that's basically when your brain is fully developed or something. And so there are movements out there to raise it back up, but that's the amendment that put it at 18. So now states, a number of them, Minnesota is one of these, that you can pre-register now. If you're 16 or 17, you can pre-register to vote. You can do it online. You can do it in person at your county election office. You can mail it into the Secretary of State. You can mail it into your local elections office. I know a lot of people, a lot of students. I teach this to them in my classes, and they just do it online, a lot of them. So if you want to look into this more, that you can go to the Secretary of State website, and that's, I believe it's sos.mn.gov is how you can get there. And there's an elections and voting tab on their website. That's the one you can click on to get more information. And in Minnesota, you can even register on the day of voting. You got to bring some form of ID with you, but it's pretty simple here in Minnesota. So what are the requirements to vote in Minnesota? Well, you got to be a U.S. citizen. Right? That's right in the amendment, 26th Amendment. And it's in Minnesota statutes now, right? You got to be at least 18 years old on Election Day. You got to be a resident of Minnesota at least 20 days before the election. Number 4 is you cannot be in jail for a felony conviction. So Minnesota changes this law in 2023 where if you're a felon, a convicted felon, but you are not in jail anymore, you're on probation, you can vote now in the state of Minnesota. Now, in many other states, you can't if you're in jail. But in Minnesota, as long as you're not in jail and you're on probation for a felony, you can vote now. And the 5th thing that sometimes stops people from voting is that your right to vote was revoked by court order. Like a judge found you mentally ill and you're not competent, or there's some guardianships where a judge has ruled you're just not competent enough to vote anymore. So a court can take away your right to vote. So that's the requirements to vote in Minnesota, so not too many. All right, so in Minnesota in 2023, the legislature also passed automatic voter registration. So when you either get or renew your driver's license, for example, or your instruction permit, or you get a state ID, a Minnesota state ID if you don't have a driver's license, that stuff can automatically register you by doing those things. So there we go with the 26th Amendment. This is the one that lowered the voting age to age 18. So as we go to break here, I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about the New York City primary for the Democrats for mayor and why I think it's kind of an important thing. So we'll talk more about that when we come back from the break. All right, welcome back to the Politics Matter show, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks again for listening to the show. This is our 1-year anniversary show, so thanks for all your support. If you have any questions or comments, send them to comment@am950radio.com. All right, for this second segment, I want to talk about arguably the biggest win for progressives so far this year, and leading into the midterms. And I'm talking about the victory by Zohran Mamdani in the Democratic primary for the New York City mayor position. Some of you may have heard about how that came out, where, it was a primary for mayor, so he moves on to the general election. But, New York City is the biggest city, so this is kind of a big deal. And he easily won, which was kind of a surprise to a lot of people. New York City has ranked choice voting, and they just recently came up with the final numbers on that. And Mamdani beat Andrew Cuomo 56 to 44%. So that was a 12 point margin. That is a big margin compared to where all the polls were for the longest time. Cuomo was ahead, and that kind of thing. But then Cuomo lost by 12 points, which kind of stunned a lot of the political pundits, and still stuns them. Because Mamdani took out a former governor of the state. Cuomo had the backing of Wall Street, the big money people. He had the backing of the big Democratic donors. He had the backing of a number of the bigger Democrat Republicans, the big Democratic Party people. But despite all of that, being outspent and, constantly attacked. He won by 12 points. And he won campaigning as he called himself a democratic socialist. He's also a Muslim. So, he had that to contend with, as the Christians made sure to point out. He's also 33 years old. So, part of the argument against him was, well, he's too young. He doesn't have any experience, even though he had been in the New York Assembly, which is their version of our state legislature. The only endorsements he really had were AOC and Bernie Sanders. But despite all of this, he easily won. So I was watching this, for the last few weeks before the election. And, he started closing a lot of ground at that point. And I think some of this started after, one of the last debates they had where he just outclassed Cuomo. And I think a lot of people saw that, and that was like, okay, yeah, I'm going to go with this guy. And then, the margin kept closing and closing and closing. And then, by the time of the election, he won. Mamdani won by 12 points. And part of this was the guy who finished in third said, with the ranked choice voting, he said, "You can vote for me, number one, but vote for Mamdani, number two. Don't vote for Cuomo." Right? So, that probably helped a little bit too. But here's why I think this is big news. Democratic Socialist, that phrase didn't scare away, very many people. No, it might have scared some of them away. But, again, 12-point victory. Granted, it was a primary, but still. He beat Andrew Cuomo, the former governor, calling himself a Democratic Socialist. So, this gets back to, I've said before on this show about how some of, my younger students, they don't, when you say socialist, they don't run for the hills like the Republicans want them to, or even some Democrats do, right? Oh my God, socialist. This is not back in the 70s and 80s with the USSR or anything like that, right? I think now more Americans are realizing that these labels don't matter as much as the policy positions do. So Mamdani's policy positions basically were on the cost of living and how tough it is in New York City in particular, but also across the country. So his message centered around, a person's economic position. And that ended up winning over the corporate Democrats, the centrist Democrats, in a big way. Number two, he beat the Democratic Party's candidate, Andrew Cuomo. So, and I actually think that didn't help Cuomo, right? Because I think right now a lot of people are pissed off, and I am one of them, at the national head of the Democratic Party type people. And I think a lot of the Democratic base feels the same way. So when they supported Cuomo, I think a lot of people were just turned off by that, and I think that really hurt them, because I think a lot of people realize that the corporate Democrats now are just shills for the the rich people, and they're not really helping us out. Plus, those are the people that, were leading us to losing to Trump twice. The worst president in history. And I think the Democratic base is just tired of that. And they voted for a candidate who aligns more with what the base wants, not with what the corporate Democrat shills want. I think we're finally done with the Republican-like candidates. At least let's hope so, because they keep losing. Third thing is Mamdani showed he was a fighter, not a milquetoast politician. I think this is another big reason, because I think the Democratic base is tired of all these politicians who do nothing but talk word salad about the Republican fascists that are taking over this country. We're tired of it. We want fighters, and he was doing that. He went after Cuomo in the debates. He's gone after Trump and the Republican Party hard. He shows he's not messing around. And I think a lot of the Democratic base wants politicians like that, so they voted for him. We don't want people like Schumer and Jeffries who aren't fighting hard enough, who, by the way, are from New York. And Mamdani just, crushed their guy Cuomo. Mamdani has shown that he will, be a fighter. And the primary voters rewarded him against the party establishment choice. So, enough with this bipartisan talk and all this. You can't work with fascists. People have had enough of this. His campaign was authentic. This is the next one. I mean, when you spoke, and I encourage you to go. I mean, there's all kinds of segments out there where he's talking about this. His campaign was authentic. I mean, when you spoke, you could tell he believed in the positions that he was taking. You could tell that he had strong feelings about what he was arguing for. He didn't come off as some, milquetoast centrist person out there saying what the Democratic donors wanted him to say. People can tell when you're BSing them. He didn't do that. Cuomo did that, but he didn't do that. And he won by 12 points. He just cruised to victory here. So being authentic was, again, another thing. And I think some national Democratic people running in, nationally and at state level should, pay attention to what this guy did. Because you can make some headways here. Number 5, and I've talked about this before, his campaign was focused on class. That is, the rest of us versus the rich. Right? He came out saying he wants to tax the rich to pay for things like free busing. I think this is a winning message for Democrats because there are many non-MAGA Republicans out there, or Republican-leaning voters who, if you make this into a class war, if you want to call it that, you might get some Republican people to vote for you because majorities in both parties, if you look at the polling, say, yeah, we should tax the rich more. So it's a winning issue, and he focused on this. Right? And I think the Democrats need to do more of this. The cost of living was a big issue. And I think it speaks to some of in the Republican Party where, if you advance policies that will help them economically, then you might be able to siphon off some of those votes. Next, he was really good on social media. Now, it doesn't take much to beat the Democratic establishment on social media, granted. But this is where he really crushed Cuomo. This is all part of his fighting spirit. And, if you go out and you talk to some Democrats about, who's like best on social media, and gets people's attention, they're going to talk about AOC and Jasmine Crockett and Bernie Sanders, right? Those types of people. They're not going to talk about Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries. Right. Well, this guy is another one of those people who is going to really shine on social media. And this really helped him with young voters who came out big. This was the biggest voting bloc for Mamdani was people 18 to 29-year-olds, the young people who historically don't come out very much, particularly in primaries, to vote. But this was his biggest voting bloc. Right, and this is something that I've been saying to Democrats is like, look, you want to get your numbers higher, go after the younger voters because their voting turnout is the worst. That's where you can get more people to vote for you, and that's what he did. He turned, low voting 18 to 29-year-old people into his highest number of votes, the highest turnout rate. So let's hope he can do that in a general election too, as well. And I don't know why he can't. Because this is what, younger people want. They want a fighter. They want a younger candidate. Right? Plus, he did a lot of grassroots campaigning where he got a lot of young people to be his volunteers, to go knock on doors and make phone calls and all the sort of stuff that grassroots campaign does. And this is another reason why he beat Cuomo. Cuomo did not have the grassroots campaign that Mamdani did. Okay, and Mamdani motivated people to get out in a primary election, which, isn't that easy to do for a primary. But he did it. You hear all the time about people, one of the reasons they give you for not voting is, well, I just wasn't motivated to vote. Well, his campaign motivated a lot more people to vote in a primary election. So national Democrats, are you paying attention to what's going on here? Because I think this is a way you can win a lot more elections. And another one, number 7, I think I'm up to. Another reason why I think this was a big win for him is because Republicans and rich people are scared. Okay, if you look at, Fox lies and, right-leaning media outlets, now they're just full of, oh, my God, there's a Democratic Socialist and Communist and Marxist, all the typical crap that they put out there. They're going hard after him, which is, again, shows you that they're scared of this guy. It's been predictable what they're going to do. And even, the rich people, same thing. Like, oh, my God, he's going to come after us and raise our taxes. Oh, boy. We're scared, right? And then there's a thing about, all these businesses are going to run out of the state of New York, and all these millionaires and billionaires are going to leave the state because he's going to try and tax them more. Yeah, okay, if that's really the only reason why you're in New York City or New York, go ahead and leave. Bye-bye. Now, you're not, people are probably not going to do that. But you can tell. Even on these business channels, they are pissed about this guy winning. Again, it's a primary. It's not a general election, but typically the Democrat wins the New York City mayor election. Okay? But I think this shows you that the working class people have had enough of the rich people and have had enough of being taken advantage of. And I'm going to talk about this in the next segment. And I really think this big, horrible bill, if it passes, is just going to piss people off even more because they're being taken advantage of, again, to feed money to the rich people. It's time to go after the rich people. And this was part of Mamdani's campaign. And when they're complaining, that he did something right here. And they're already starting their whining and complaining about, oh no, he's going to tax, everybody. He's going to raise everybody's taxes. They are scared of this guy. Finally, he listened to the people and what they wanted. Instead of the political consultant class, which Democrats pay a lot of money to for them to lose elections. Enough of that. He turned this into, and this is what he was, one of the segments I watched of him is like, I listened to people. I didn't try and lecture people with why they should vote for me. I listened to what they wanted, and I took that and I made that into my policies. Yeah, which a lot of it was about income inequality, is what he said. The inequality between the rich and the poor. So, again, you can't argue with the results. 12-point win. So Democrats, you got to go out there. You got to listen to people, not talk at them, like lecture them. You're just going to turn them off. And by going with the corporate Democrat centrist, positions like the big money donors want, it's not a winning message anymore. This guy is showing you how to win elections. So this election kind of reminds me of AOC's win in 2018 over Joe Crowley, who was like second or third in line in the House of Representatives. And she's some bartender in New York City and ends up beating him. So, she beat at that point, the establishment darling in the primary. Well, Mamdani did it too. So now he moves on to the general election. He's going to run against the current corrupt mayor, Eric Adams, who's running as an independent because the Democrats kicked him out because he made a deal with the Trump administration where they dropped corruption charges against him, and he let them come in with ICE and round up a bunch of people in New York City. And it also looks like Cuomo's staying in, too, to run as some, other third party because he's going to get billionaire money. So, and predictably, a lot of the, some of the Democrats in New York are like, oh, I got to go talk to him and I'm not endorsing him and all this stuff because they're bought off. Right? And I think people have finally realized that, enough of this stuff. The Democratic Party elites are not going to help us. They're not going to save us from the fascists that are now in the government. And Mamdani succeeded with motivating people to get out there and do it. Because in the end, we are the only ones that are going to save ourselves. So hopefully the Democrats take some knowledge here of what he did and they can use it in their own elections. All right, so that's the bright spot of today's show. When we come back, we're going to talk about the big horrible bill in the Senate, which is not a bright spot. But we'll get to that on the other side of the break. All right, welcome back to the third segment of today's Politics Matter show, how civics, politics, and law affect you, here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for listening to the show. If you have any questions or comments, send them to comment@am950radio.com. Again, thanks to everybody. This is our 1-year anniversary show, I believe. So thanks for all support throughout this year and in future years. So, again, I'm doing this Wednesday morning. You're listening to this. If you're listening to it on the radio, it's on Sunday night. So yesterday, the big horrible bill, as I call it, passed the Senate barely with a tiebreaker. So it was 50-50, and then, of course, J.D. Vance cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. So now the House has passed a version by one vote, remember. In the Senate, it was a tie vote. So when you hear them running around saying this is the mandate that the voters gave us and blah, 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 yeah, you passed it by one vote in the House and it was a tie in the Senate. Give me a break. Okay. Now, I've talked about both of these bills at length in previous shows, so I'm not really going to get into that much today. But still going to talk about it here. So remember, the House passed their own version. The Senate passed their own version. They are different versions. Okay, so what happens now is that the Senate bill goes to the House, where the House can, if the House wants to, vote on what the Senate bill is. Now, if they are going to try and get this done by July 4th, which is what Trump demands of them, which is Friday, they're going to have to get moving on this quick. So don't be surprised if by the time you hear this, they did pass the Senate version in the House. No, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that, there were some people in the House that are saying, no, we don't want that. So if the House doesn't like, or doesn't have the votes for the Senate version, then the House can do their own bill again, or make some changes to it, and pass their own version again. And then that would have to go to the Senate again. Or they can do what's called a conference committee, where the House and the Senate people get together, on a committee, not all of them, but enough of them, on what's called a conference committee. And then they hash out the differences between the House and the Senate bill. And then whatever they come up with in that conference committee, then the House and the Senate both vote on the same thing. So those are some things that can happen. Another thing that could happen is, the House votes it down and then, nothing gets done for a while. But, as I said before, I think the Republicans, they got the numbers. They're going to ram something through. And it wouldn't surprise me if by the time you're listening to this, they did. Whether it's a Senate bill or another version of the House bill or whatever, that they were able to do something. So, I really hope I'm wrong about that. But, I hope I am, but it wouldn't surprise me if I'm wrong. So I thought I would spend, this segment basically calling out some of the, in particular 4 Republicans in the Senate who deserve to be called cowards. I've called them cowards before on other shows, and this just, what they did on this bill just cements their cowardice, right? So the first is Mitch McConnell. During this Senate bill, he said that people will get over getting kicked off of Medicare. Or I'm sorry, kicked off of Medicaid. People will just get over it. So it's okay to do it. People aren't paying attention. They won't know, or they'll get over it, or who cares, right? Now we'll see if he's right, if this passes, because that's what's going to happen. In the state of Kentucky, where he is the senator, the forecast is that 200,000 people will get kicked off of Medicaid in the state of Kentucky. And I hope all 200,000 of them, or whatever that number is, lets Mitch McConnell know about it and how they're not getting over it and how this is making their life worse. While Mitch McConnell's cashing his, $1 million checks that he gets from his donors. Now, granted, Kentucky is a safe Republican state. They're probably going to continue to vote for Republicans, although they do have a governor who's a Democrat at the moment. But will they continue to vote for Republicans after they're kicked off of Medicaid, or their hospitals close, or their schools close, or their own health care costs go up? Probably. As long as they own the libs and they do what their D leader wants, they're fine with it. But, when you watch Fox Lies all day long, what do you expect? Now, I certainly hope that the people of Kentucky, change their ways, but they haven't shown us that they will. All right, so the next coward is moving on to Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri. A few days ago, now again, I'm on Wednesday, so this was like over the weekend, and I think maybe even on Monday. He was out there talking about, we can't kick people off of Medicaid. We just can't do it. So, he was complaining about that. Well, not to anybody's surprise, he has no spine. He voted for the bill as I predicted that he would. He ran away from those comments that he made faster than he ran away from those January 6 protesters in that famous video we all remember. So, again, I hope Missourians remember what Josh Hawley just did when they start losing their health care and their schools and their hospitals. And they go, maybe got to declare bankruptcy because they can't afford their own medical care. And Vice President Vance is the next coward. No surprise how he voted on it, right? But what makes him even more of a coward, because he already is, but more of one is his comments after the vote. And, he tweeted out the following statement, and I'm going to quote him here. Okay. To think that this will, the bill will bankrupt the country more than the other policy is flooding the country with illegal immigration and then giving those migrants generous benefits. The one big, beautiful bill fixes this problem. Everything else, the CBO baseline, the proper baseline, these are the things that are predicting 17 million people will get kicked off of Medicaid. This is just the minutia of Medicaid policy. Is immaterial compared to the ICE money in the immigration enforcement provisions. Close quote. So, basically what he just said is, the hell with the people on Medicaid. It's more important that we round up the immigrants. Now, if that doesn't show you what he thinks about his fellow Americans, I don't know what is. Yeah, let's kick people, poor people, old people, off of Medicaid, and yeah, let's deport all these, illegal immigrants too. Jeez. Now, that's bad enough, but I'm saving the last thing here for Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. Okay? Because she went out there and voted for this. So she was the tie, basically the vote that made it a tie in the Senate. And, she's claimed she's a moderate and blah, blah, blah. And she was out there talking about how, well, this is going to hurt people in Alaska. Well, she's not a moderate anymore. She just sold out the United States. For some exceptions to the SNAP benefit cutoffs and the Medicaid cutoffs for her state, but not for the rest of us. And by the way, that extra money that she's going to get, or the exemptions, they're not going to last long. And she's not even and what about the rest of the bill, Lisa? Okay. But to her, who cares? Good enough for a few people in Alaska to send us into further fascism. Right? Like she's trying to save Alaska from that fate. And when she was on the news, when somebody told her that, Rand Paul, he was one of the no votes because of the $1 trillion of the national debt that's going to go up. That was his main beef about it. He's like, yeah, Lisa Murkowski got a bailout for Alaska. And she's like, I can't believe he said that. Yeah, well, the rest of us can, Lisa, because that's what you did. And to come out there and later say that she hopes that the House changes this bill because it's not a good bill and they rush through it and blah, 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 blah. Well, you voted for it, Lisa. You could have stopped all this. You could have stopped the bad bill. You said, oh, we rushed through it, blah, blah, blah. You could have just simply voted no. And that would have happened, Lisa. Why are you voting for it? If you think it's so horrible. Well, because she got bought off. Right? It's really that simple. During her interview, I thought she was going to cry. Like, how dare you call it a bailout? She doesn't care that, Americans are going to be, the rest of us are going to be disadvantaged. No one's buying your BS here, Lisa. You took the money. It's that simple. So, this Senate bill just shows you how politics really matters in your life. Republicans are going to make it harder for all of us now, except the rich and the corporations. So you got to get active and fight back and get ready for the 2026 midterm elections. We will talk to you next week.